This is a March Brown version of Pete Hidy's Flymph. And a Flymph is a combination of adult fly and nymph. So before we use the term emergers, this is basically an emerger. It's an unweighted soft hackle that runs just under the surface of the water. And it's a really versatile fly. If you want to fish it deeper in the water column, you can add a bead head to it, or you can add lead wire underneath, which is my preference, underneath the dubbing, and use practically any color dubbing you like to create any type of fly. So this fly forms a nice basic foundation for any number of soft hackle patterns. Pretty much any standard length nymph hook will work for this fly. And this is a J Stockard number 210 in size 14. Get it straight in my vise here. And for thread, I'm using UTC's 70 denier in red. And that red is important for this fly because that hot spot head creates a feature of the fly. And I start my thread about an eye length and a half back. I like for that thread to mark the front of my body, and that's where I'm going to tie in my hackle. So I trim off that tag in and bring my thread back to that front of the wrap. Now, this fly only uses two materials. This is an India henback and natural, which is kind of a speckled brown, and some dubbing. That's pretty much all it uses. Now we're going to strip all of this fuzzy stuff, this marabou-like feather off the bottom down here. Now here's a feather I've already stripped all the fuzzies off of, and this is kind of an interesting technique from our normal tip tie-in for soft hackles. I'm going to tie this in by the actual stem with the feather pointing out over the eye of the hook. And I place that stem right at the front of my thread wraps. And I give it just a little bit of space before the feathers there because I want a little space, and maybe angle it a little bit. Take a couple of loose wraps. We want to keep it on the side or the top. And then we wrap back all the way to the rear of our thread wraps and trim off that extra stem. And then let's create a thread base all the way back to about the barb of the hook. And once I get to the barb of the hook, I'm going to bring the thread back to about the point. Now for the tail, we don't need to reach for another hackle. We're just going to actually strip about 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch of fibers off the other side of this hackle. So pull them out straight, line them up, and strip them off. And that gives us a nice tail. And that tail is about 1/2 to 3/4 of a hook shank in length. So give that bobbin a counterclockwise twist so it'll jump to the rear. And let's bind those feathers down, kind of holding them towards me to keep them on top of the hook shank, all the way back to the barb, and then bring my thread back to the front and kind of clean up some of that messy stuff there. You don't really have to, but we like to tie a clean fly. And I'm going to check my hackle here just to make sure. I'm going to pull it up to kind of kink that stem a bit. Okay, that looks good. I've got plenty of space in front there to wrap and create my head. Now the body of this fly traditionally is hare's ear dubbing, just in natural hare's ear. But where I fish, whoops, catching on my fly there. Where I fish, I like to use this darker brown blend. And this is a blend of March Brown and March Brown Rabbit and Brown Rabbit and a little bit of Rusty Brown Rabbit to give it a little bit of a red tint. We create this dubbing loop for this fly a little bit differently than most of our dubbing loops. And I like to use a little wax on my thread. Instead of creating the loop first and then inserting the hare, we actually create just a normal dubbing noodle. And we try to keep it fairly thin. So we're going to wrap this. And we want about 3 inches. We don't want to run out of dubbing because it's definitely harder to add dubbing to a loop than it is to take dubbing away. So once I have my dubbing loop, and there's about a 3-inch loop, I then make my loop with my thread. And then I can just I don't have to hold that loop at all, just bring that thread all the way forward and let it hang behind the hook eye. And I'm just going to use just a little electronics test clip here and spin this. You can use a dubbing spinner, but we don't spin this as much as we do a normal dubbing loop, probably 12 or 15 times. And we want that red thread to show through because that's actually a feature of this fly. So there's about 15 times or so, and I just start making wraps back toward the tail of my fly. You can see that red thread showing through. That's just how Pete Hidy designed this fly. And so we start those wraps right at the tail. And then we wrap forward up the body of the fly. And it doesn't matter if it has a bit of taper or not. It's a pretty buggy fly anyways, but I'm going to wrap a little, whoops, sometimes have to retwist our thread there a little bit. And I'm going to wrap up to the very back of that hackle. Give it a couple more wraps for a little bit of a taper there. And when I get to the back of the hackle, I pull the hackle back and I take one wrap in front of the hackle, and then I tie off my dubbing loop. And then I reach in and cut off my excess dubbing loop. And before I wrap the hackle on here, I like to pick that out. Depending on your individual loop, it might be not quite buggy enough, might be too slim of a body, because we definitely want these to be a bit buggy. So now I take hackle pliers and grab my hackle by the tip, and I'm just going to sweep those back, and we're just going to make about 3 turns of hackle. There's 1, and with each of those, let's pull those feather fibers back. There's 2, there's 3. I'm actually going to come up there one more time, and now let's tie it off. And it looks like a mess behind the eye, but we're going to clean that up. Take a couple of wraps. Reach in there with our scissors, cut off that excess feather, and then pull all this mess back away from the eye and wrap back over the base of those feathers a bit. Oops, a little dubbing there. Oh, a little bit of dubbing stuck to my thread. There we go. And build kind of a medium-sized thread head. And take our whip finish tool and give it a 4 or 5 turn whip finish. Whoops, don't grab that hackle. Trim off our thread, and I have to grab that little fiber at the front there. Yeah, I can see that on the screen. All right. Some of these really thick pieces, I do like the buggy fly, but some of these little thick pieces I'll trim off. And there we have it. I'll add a little head cement to this. A little Sally Hansen's Hard as Nails. And all right, and our fly is finished. Really a buggy, great pattern. It's a basic soft hackle that's really simple to tie and only uses 2 materials. So I think you'll enjoy it. You can tie it weighted, you can tie it with a bead head, a lot of variations you can use with this fly.